Thank you very much, Laurent. And I'd actually like to stay with you for a moment. You are the co-founder and co-CEO of a European company, and therefore the European AI Act will be a very, very pertinent piece of legislation. What is your thought on the way in which the EU AI Act can regulate generative AI in a successful way?
Thank you for this question. I mean, to be honest, I'm a bit like all my the fellow innovators here in Europe. I'm a bit worried, I would say, by the regulation, by over-regulating. There's a risk of divide between continents where technology is made in the outside of EU, I would say, in the US, of course, but also in China, in Middle East, that's becoming very active in the field. And we in Europe only buy this technology, like we buy the cloud, we buy the chips, we buy the internet search, and so on. So it's not too late. We are at a technological revolution, and that's precisely when everything is being designed that there's a reshuffle of maybe leading position. Here in Europe, we have a good innovation. We have a smaller but a very active ecosystem, especially in startups, but also in academia and so on. So it's, let's not break the dynamics. Of course, don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that regulation is not important. I mean, we have discussed the technology are very disruptive, and there are many bad ways of using that. But I'd say the focus should be more on the use cases, the way we use the technology, rather than regulating the technology itself. And I would say what I've seen as a proposal to regulate this type of technology applies to like the deep learning type of technology we were designing 10 years ago, but we had to like bring guarantees on the sufficient level of accuracy. What does it mean for general purpose technology? Accuracy for which? So we are here in terms of we have to think of use cases. And in a specific use cases, of course, you can bring guarantees on the accuracies and so on, but it's very difficult to assess the technology in itself. And I would say if we really have to comply a priori, it will be extremely expensive, extremely hard, extremely challenging for us to do. And again, this favors monopoly. So that's I would advocate for a diversity of actors like large companies. Of course, we work with AWS. We should not be opposed to them. We should work together. But there has to be space for startups, for academia, for open source, all these type of different actors with an emphasis on academia. I would say myself, I'm a former university professor, and I'm terrified that this domain is being shaped only by for-profit organizations like large companies. So I would push for regulation, but that brings a diversity of new actors.
Thank you very much, Laurent. And if we talk about diversity of new actor, it seems obvious to also turn to Sasha and hear your thoughts on the way in which the EU AI Act can regulate generative AI, just given that this is the most advanced piece of regulation that we are discussing at the moment.
Thanks for that question. Our core mission at AWS is to democratize access to AI/ML and to empower startups with the tools to use AI/ML to transform their communities. So very much resonate, Laurent, with what you were saying, and also resonate with the way in which you articulated the struggle that's ongoing from countries in the EU to navigate how to successfully regulate this kind of technology, because they're in front of two challenges. One is that they want to take advantage of the economic opportunities that you mentioned with the Goldman Sachs review. And then the other side is that they obviously want to make sure that they are protecting the fundamental rights, health, and safety of their citizens. So how do we make sure that we have a use case specific approach to regulating this technology that doesn't unintentionally regulate low risk use cases and allows for the practical application of this technology? And I think there are two concrete ways, Sebastian. The first is to focus on risk-based approaches and use case specific regulatory approaches. And then the second is to embrace international standards as a mechanism for fostering global interoperability interoperability. And I see a lot of people from the standards world, including you, around the table. So I hope that that resonates in terms of the possible way forward. In terms of risk-based approaches to AI regulation, I think one of the biggest successes of the OECD.AI principles is that they laid the groundwork for a common understanding about how AI should be regulated, notably through the accountability principle, which recognizes different roles of developers and deployers of AI systems and different contexts. And from our perspective, because we see the risk associated with AI as inherently dependent on context, what we hear from our customers is that regulations will be most effective when they target the specific high-risk use. And Laurent mentioned it himself, and his best place to say is that overly broad regulation or regulating AI as a generic technology would in fact harm the innovation ecosystem in Europe, but also beyond. For generative AI and foundation models in the framework of the EU AI Act, how to regulate this, we see this not only the need to consider that these models are not de facto high-risk AI systems, but when they are deployed in high-risk contexts, responsibility for compliance falls on the deployer that provides this intended purpose to this high-risk use case of generative AI. And secondly, if tailored requirements are developed, that they are developed based on technical feasibility and internationally recognized standards building on the OECD principles. Lastly, I just want to mention briefly the question of standards, because interoperable, trustworthy AI was a pillar of the OECD principles, as was ensuring a policy environment that opens the way for the deployment of trustworthy AI systems. So we see standards really as a kind of Rosetta Stone, which will help customers and governments be able to translate these regulatory requirements into compliance mechanisms. When we talk to our customers about the EU AI Act, their primary concern is that they want to understand when, why, and how to comply with these upcoming regulatory regimes. And this kind of clarity that is provided largely through standards, we see as absolutely essential. We look forward to obviously continuing to work with the OECD, because we see that as a particularly appropriate place to think about, you're doing this already in your working groups, how to, for example, classify risks. And we see that as an absolutely essential piece to ensuring that kind of market interoperability going forward.
Thank you, Sasha. And we've heard a few times now the issue around, the access to those models, that only a small number of entities are capable of training those and providing those models, and what it means for the democratization of access, and also for issues of control, who controls the training, who controls the training data. And I'd be quite curious, turning to you, Rebecca, in particular, the term that's sometimes being used is a compute divide in terms of resources, in terms of control, in terms of competencies. And I would be curious to understand your perspective on how those issues around compute divides, about access, about control, should be handled.
Thank you. And I just want to say I absolutely agree with that last point with regard to standards and interoperability and the role of the OECD through the principles to really guide some of this collective international work. And that leads me back to the question of the digital divide, the notion of very large companies and entities and labs having the capacity to deploy these models and the challenges for smaller organizations in order to do this. And I have sort of three perspectives on this that I wanted to share. One is, I think there is an increased burden of transparency and accountability with regard to those large entities that are deploying those models, really in terms of providing access for external scrutiny and oversight with regard to the development and deployment of those models, because of the size and power and influence that they are having over markets around the world. And so I think that's one piece of the question, which is both how do we set collective protocols around how large entities can do that responsibly while protecting their own competitive interests, but with some sense of independence and external scrutiny. So I think that's important in terms of the corporate actors. I think that's also important in terms of governments thinking about how they set up systems whereby they can can support that work. But I also want to bring up two other points with regard to the digital divide. And both of these, I think, have relevance with regard to the fact that many of these entities, in fact, all of them, are in highly developed economies. So when we think about the majority world and the way and the implications of the deployment of these models in terms of countries that are not building these capacities or may not have economies in order to do this, I think we really need to understand, one, the workers and the labor, the impact on labor with regard to these systems, both in terms of how many workers in the global south are being employed to train or rate AI systems or otherwise. We did some work with DeepMind, specifically looking at how do you responsibly and equitably source data enrichment workers in the development of this work. I think that's a key piece that we have to keep in mind as we think about size and scale in terms of the deployment. We need to think about the impact in terms of climate and sustainability of these large-scale models, and what does that mean in terms of the majority world in particular in terms of impact. And then we also need to think about impacted communities. And Hiroki talked a little bit about the potential for algorithmic bias and discrimination with regard to these systems. And so how do we intentionally set up ways in which citizens can be engaged in not only in the development of these systems, but in understanding some of the implications in that work. And I'll just mention in that regard that we've been intentionally trying to think about how do we shift the gaze to center the people, the workers, the citizens who are impacted by these technologies into the technology development conversation. And we were really pleased at the Summit for Democracy, which is hosted by the State Department and the White House together with governments around the world recently, to announce the launch of a global task force to focus specifically on this question of how do you set up structures and systems in order to engage citizens much more directly in thinking about not only the implications of the technology, but the ways in which we can better specify the models, better create responsible and transparent systems so that we can, at the end of the day, do what we've all been talking about, which is really thinking about deploying these systems for the benefit of people in society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I see that, Keith, you've already raised your hand to comment on these same issues. I'd like to ask you to be as concise as possible because we're already starting to run against the clock.
Yeah, I will. So look, I just want to make 2 points on the topic of the democratization of this technology and the concern over the consolidation, the dominance, as Hiroki put it at the beginning of his presentation. I know right now it does look that way, right? I mean, there are big companies that have access to the computing systems and access to the data model, the data sets, and frankly, just the resources in general. A lot of the innovation is coming out of Silicon Valley and a few companies. But I'll tell you what's actually happening that maybe they're not in the headlines, and this is how it's going to play out. First off, almost every country that I speak to is either already started to or looking at investing in building their own sovereign foundation models. And so you're going to see a lot of activity happening there across the world. I think within 2 years, most developed nations will already be well down their way. Sweden already has it. So it's going to happen pretty much at scale. So there's going to be a lot of sovereign investment in more sort of indigenous foundation models. That's number one. And number two, sure, the biggest companies in the tech space are definitely out in front, and for good reason. But that again, that's not the whole story. There are at least 1,000 startups across the world that are building their own versions of both general purpose transformers and then more domain specific ones that are fine-tuned around specific areas. And you're just going to see the democratization of this technology is happening already quite widely. And so whether you're using an API from Microsoft on their chatbot, or you're down using an open source model from Hugging Face or NVIDIA or whatever, there's actually a lot of different ways to go about this. And so there's a few big names in the headlines today, but it'll be a very different conversation a year from now. And so I just want to say there's actually a lot going on that maybe is not as obvious, but I do not believe that there will be a few companies that control this technology. I do not think that's going to play out at all.
Thank you very much, Keith, for your assessment of the situation. And we've actually got the numbers now from the poll, and it's a fairly solid number of responses. So we've got around 200 responses, which makes the numbers quite meaningful. As expected, pretty much everyone has heard about the letter. There is a substantial, sizable fraction of people who support it, but an equally sizable fraction who are very critical and say, well, that might be nice, but it's not realistic. But interestingly, by far the largest number of answers, and in fact, almost the majority of answers, agrees with the statement that, well, if technology advances rapidly, then policymaking has to advance just as rapidly in new approaches and new formats. And this really confirms that we are spending our time very wisely here, and also confirms that the OECD is spending time and resources very wisely in having and fostering those policy discussions. And I'd like to, with an eye on time, I'd like to first of all ask our guest, Dragos Tudorache, to provide his view and his closing thoughts, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes left at the end for one or two questions from the room and the audience here as well. So very welcome, Dragos Tudorache, and we're curious about your thoughts. Over to you.
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Many thanks for the invitation, and sorry for not having been able to come in earlier. Just I caught the last minutes, the last changes you've had, and clearly this was a very rich afternoon for you. Fortunately, also, I'll have to literally run at past, because I have to propose one of my files at the working group in plenary. We are in Strasbourg in the plenary, so it's a very busy week. So I'll be very, very short so that I also have this time for questions at the very end. I'll actually pick up on exactly where you left it, presenting the results of the questionnaire, I guess, in the room. And it's actually, I was smiling when I saw the results, because you may or may not know that we have just 2 days ago replied ourselves to that letter. And when I say we, I mean the entire body of rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs working on the AI Act. And we did so because we also thought, like it seems the majority of those that responded to the questionnaire, we thought that the solution is not asking for a pause on the development of technology or for a moratorium, but to actually take very considerable, responsible action in providing the right policy responses to that. And it's true that it is a technology that is very fastly moving, and it's not easy to find the right rules to put in place and the right policies to put in place. But it should not be taken away from the responsibility we have, those of us that have that responsibility of making policy and regulating to actually do so. So maybe that's the point which I want to make, because we are literally in the final stages of wrapping up our work in Parliament on the AI Act. We were, in fact, supposed to wrap it up today. We had this afternoon planned for the last, what we call political shadows meeting, so basically the last meeting at political level between the team of entire rapporteurs. We were not able to do so. We turned into still a technical meeting because we are still figuring out the package of rules, the regime that we would apply to general purpose and particularly foundational models and generative AI, which, as you know, it's an endeavor that we as Parliament have taken upon ourselves even before December and the emergence of the big debate in the public domain on generative AI, ChatGPT, etc. We thought from the very beginning that we cannot, in a way, miss this opportunity of having the AI Act in our hands and not say something and not devise a dedicated regime for foundational models. And I fully agree with one of the colleagues intervening before, saying that what we need is not a de facto or even express application of the label high risk on foundational models. That's not the solution, and that's not what we're doing, just to be very clear. I can't say exactly how the negotiations in the last couple of days are going to end, but I can pretty comfortably say that we are not going to simply put foundational models into the high-risk category. What we are doing is to try and see which of the obligations that we have right now in various parts of the text will actually apply, maybe in different form, but will apply to the specificities of general purpose AI and foundational models in particular. We are working, in fact, on 2 levels. One is to write a set of rules that apply to all general purpose AI and which have to do mostly with obligations that providers of such models would have for the entities downstream in the value chain of AI, but also a dedicated regime, a specific provision that we're introducing in the text on foundational models. We are defining what foundational models would be, the scope of this regulation, in a dedicated definition in Article 3, and we are using the Stanford definition, again, just to make sure. I also heard many speaking of the importance of internationally recognized standards. I have been advocating for that from the very start, and I'm very happy, in fact, that having closed last week already the part of the text on the standards, I can say that I think we have done a good job in Parliament in really moving completely a bit the philosophy of the text, which initially was saying that the Commission would be writing common specifications, into actually standards work done in the standard setting bodies where, from my point of view, they should be done. And that I think will also be allowing for alignment at international level in terms of standards, which would be so fundamentally important for ensuring convergence on how we develop AI in the future, accepting the fact that in terms of norms, we would probably be in different speeds, in different jurisdictions, but I think that is okay. We will have to live with that as long as, again, we work together in converging standards, and again, the principles are aligned, and OECD has done tremendous work in making sure that we are aligned on principles, and that's, I think, is important. So that's where we are. Still some tweaks also on how we deal with high risk. We are introducing, and again, that's an objective on our side in bringing balance between the objective of the regulation to provide protection to individual rights, to the health of our society, so on and so forth, but at the same time, to encourage innovation, not to put unnecessary barriers to growth and to the uptake of AI in our economies, because that's, I think, what we should all want, or at least there is I think, a solid majority in this House which wants that. So the way we have tweaked what the Commission initially proposed in how to deal with high risk ensures, from my point of view, and again, I think we're going to have a majority for that, getting some tweaks which are still pending in the coming days, but we are not only having the annex of the AI Act, which lists the domains which are high risk, which from the point of view of us who proposed the filter was not enough, because it was unnecessarily labeling generically domains as high risk without accepting that there might be God knows how many variations of use cases that actually might not be high risk, but just because they would be developed in that particular domain, that particular area, they would unnecessarily have to bear the compliance costs, and therefore we have introduced a filter with a threshold of significant risk that will have to be assessed, self-assessed, again, something that remains in the text. The logic of self-assessment remains in the text. It will be a self-assessment that will be done. Am I actually passing the threshold of significant risk, even though I am in the domains of high risk in Annex 3? Answer yes, no, which is an answer which I give myself. If no, if yes, then of course I go to compliance. If no, I simply notify the regulator that I am in that situation, and that's it. So again, our effort is to bring balance in all of the these key provisions of the text, so that we keep those two objectives in check. And in terms of timing, and I'll stop and still have a few minutes for questions and answers. In terms of timing, we are now working with a next week scheduled meeting, which is meant to be the last meeting, which means that we'll be able to vote in committees early May now. So we're pushing a bit the calendar again with about 2 weeks. Voting in committees in early May and early June, voting in the plenary, which means maybe a handshake, a symbolic handshake with the Swedish presidency before the end of June. But the actual work, the bulk of the work in the negotiations with the Council to be done under the Spanish presidency. And there we have already a calendar that we work with the Spanish presidency, and I am pretty confident that we can actually finish by the end of the year. So I'll stop here and take a few questions if I can.
Thank you very much, Dragos, for this insight, well, I would say into the boiler room of policy making and the cutting edge of the discussions, and also in particular the status update on how generative AI is likely to be handled in the AI Act, at least from the perspective of the Parliament. And I, of course, very much liked your remarks about European standardization and the role of it as the JTC 21 chair. We've got about, I think, 3 minutes left in this session, and hopefully we can handle 1 or 2 very brief questions and very brief answers. And I see.
Maybe if I may just collect the questions, and then at the end I'll try to bundle the answers all together.
We will collect questions. So I see lots of hands going up here in the room. So can I ask you to be extremely brief? We'll just collect the questions, and no guarantees that we can answer them all. But I'd just like to go around the room. I think the first hand was over there.
Hi, my name is Carlos Ignacio Gutierrez. I represent the Future of Life Institute, the organization that created the letter. Just a really quick reflection on our ethos for this letter and the organization. We believe in proactive action with high-risk AI systems. Maintaining a reactive approach is something that we want to avoid because of the mysteries that can happen with these systems that have emerging capabilities, have possibilities that we don't know about. And the reason that we created this letter is to generate 2 proactive calls. The first proactive call is to action. First, it's self-governance. We ask organizations to self-govern their own models so as to benefit the rest of society and have a race to the top. And if that doesn't work, then we ask governments to act in favor of their jurisdictions. We now have a short document in our website with potential policies that governments can evaluate to see which ones are best for them. But that's in our website now. It's called Pause, Policymaking in the Pause. And the second call to action is discussion. What we've been incredibly encouraged about is the fact that everywhere in the world now, people are discussing the risks of these systems. And we don't believe in having a pause in all systems because not all systems have these society level risks, but just the ones that are the largest and heaviest ones. We believe in a flourishing future, just like the Amazon representative mentioned. There's a lot of really good uses for AI, but we are concerned and want to be proactive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I saw one hand at the far end over there.
Thank you. My name is Inma Martinez. I am an AI scientist. I have built AI for commercial purposes. And I'm here as the chair of the multi-stakeholder expert group at the GPA. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'd like to add to the conversation that I feel that there is a massive opportunity for us to think of AI in different terms. There's a before and after. As we know, just like when the moon landing happened, we learned that unfortunately the moon is not made of cheese, but also that is a place where you can live. That's why we are now going to Mars. And I think that our cheese in our situation is that many companies have developed AI for innovation's sake, which many times derails and it doesn't contain any ergonomics or human factors, such as developing AI systems that compose music or paint, etc., and really ostracize humans thinking about that horrible future. I think the opportunity in our case lies in thinking of AI as a tool to build a better society, which is how many companies build and compete and are leaders, not just by innovating for innovation's sake, but by building better products. Lego, for example, hasn't changed the Legos in 25 years. So I think that there is room for us to have another mindset and track to think about AI as an ergonomic product and service fit for humans to use, and in those terms, not just for innovation or policy or ethics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm having an eye on the Secretariat whether we can overrun for 2 minutes, but we're already eating into the next session. So I think there was a hand from the UK and also from the US. UK's been covered, so there's a hand from the.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for moderating this. One of these questions for Keith. First of all, thank you for your co-sharing the OECD blueprint on building national AI capacity. A great report. The question is, a lot of the discussion here is how do we build trust in these generative AI systems? And the question is, what role does compute choices play in helping facilitate and advancing trustworthy AI, this kind of technical dimension to AI compute or to AI? Thank you.
Well, these systems are not simple, right? People talk about ChatGPT like it's one model, but it's a complex system, right, of models built on top of an even more complex stack of software and computers. So and within that, I think you have, and just oversimplifying it, but you have basically two opportunities to do it right? You've got sort of the design phase, and then you have later, right? And in the design phase, you want to use both principles and standards and techniques to ensure that the data going in and the way that it's being trained, the actual nature of the training, ultimately, as the most recent speaker said, things are being thoughtfully done through the lens of benefit to humanity and use, right? And so that has to be done early. And if it's not done early, well, then you have the even more complex job of cleaning it up post training, which frankly, it's unclear. You can make improvements. There's no question. You can put in guardrails, but it's a lot harder to do. And so the tools, the software tools, the compute used to fine tune these models, they're in the early stages now. I mean, they're coming out now. I mean, all the companies are sort of rolling out these tools that reduce bias and mitigate toxicity and affect, reduce hallucinations and all these challenges. There are tools coming out, but we're in phase 1.0, right? So you definitely have a better product if you engineer it from the beginning more thoughtfully. So that isn't really about computing as much as it is that whole stack of hardware and software and all the tools and techniques used. And that's, I think the world is figuring that out together, and I saw a very interesting interview with Ilya Sutskever, the co-founder of OpenAI, talking about the techniques that they're putting in place. And I know that just from talking to my own colleagues with NVIDIA, that the tools that we're rolling out and the different guardrails. So I know that there's an aggressive push from industry to deal with that issue, right? And so I think there'll be a lot of innovation on the tools, the fine tuning, and whatnot. So it is a stack of technology. It's complex and requires a lot of thoughtful design from the beginning to the end.
Thank you very much, Keith. And I saw a very, very urgent hand over there. Is that something that can be said in 30 seconds?
Yes, so apologies. So Conrad Tucker, professor of mechanical engineering at Carnegie Mellon. This is for my students. And so on behalf of the students in the AI course I teach, they want to know how the cultural aspects will be factored into the decision-making for the metrics of trust, transparency.
Okay, I think this is one of the questions that is very important, that deserves long answers that we don't have time for in this session. But thank you very much for raising the question, and this is already the jumping off point for future discussions. I would like to say a big thank you to our keynote speakers, to our panelists, to the Secretariat for preparing this session very, very carefully.